The time has come to tell the truth.
I'll wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Vince Cable, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, former Secretary of State for Business, Innovation, Skills, and President of the Board of Trade, and author of a fascinating new book, Eclipsing the West. Welcome to the podcast, Vince.
Thank you very much indeed.
It's wonderful to have you on. Now, the first question that I'd like to ask is, what made you want to write this book in the first place?
Well, I think ever since I was a student, I've been fascinated by this whole issue of the two biggest countries in the world by population, because I was interested in economic development. What is it that makes countries grow? Why are some countries rich and poor? And the cases of China and India always fascinated me. And then through life, I got to know India quite well. I'd been traveling there for 50 years, writing extensively about India, China more recently. When I was chief economist at Shell, I did a lot of preparatory work about 30 years ago. So I've followed the development of China and India, and now we're in a kind of remarkable position where these two countries of 1.4 billion are approaching a point where they are potentially the two economic superpowers in the world. And of course, there's still the United States. But if we look ahead, if India keeps growing at something like its present rate, within a couple of decades, it will be up there. China already is a superpower. So, trying to envisage what the planet looks like with two of the three dominant powers in the world are in Asia. And it's partly looking backwards, how is it that they developed in the way that they have and why China got ahead. But it's partly looking forward to what will happen when these two countries dominate the world economy, environmental pollution, carbon emissions, the rules under which the world operates, the so-called international order, the rules of trade, nuclear proliferation, pandemics, all of these things that affect all of us. So it's a mixture of looking backwards and looking forwards in these enormous and fascinating countries.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned at the very start of the book, which I think is a real illustration of where we are, is when you discuss the purchasing power parity of India, China, and the US in comparison. Could you just explain what exactly the purchasing power parity means and why it is important for understanding the situation that we're in regarding India, China, and the UK and the West more broadly?
Well, it's been accepted for quite a long time by international bodies, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, that simply measuring countries' economic strength on the basis of their current exchange rates is very, very misleading. I mean, if you take a simple example, if you have $100 and you take it to anywhere in India and you spend it in a shop or a restaurant, you get far more than you would spending $100 in the United States or Europe. Similarly in China. And it's, I think, accepted that India's economy, in reality, in terms of what people actually spend and earn, is probably 3 times bigger than the official numbers would suggest. China may be 50% more. There is a lot of controversy around this, but in terms of the actual reality of people's living standards, in terms of the size of economies, what the purchasing power parity approach does is it simply ignores current exchange rates, which can be all over the place for all kind of reasons. President Trump makes a speech, the dollar goes up or down. It's got nothing to do with the underlying strength of the economy. So purchasing power parity is an attempt to try to capture how big, how strong economies are under the surface.
And you touch on living standards there, and that's something that obviously you discuss in the book in regards to the living standards both in India and in China. Do you think that this is something that is sometimes ignored in discussions of the sort of the emergent economies of both countries, in that there are obviously incredibly wealthy individuals in both nations, but there are also a great deal of individuals who are in a state of poverty and beyond the kind of poverty we might imagine in the UK and the US. And how do you think that that should be factored into economic discussions? Because, of course, discussing poverty and the levels of poverty can often be a very emotional subject, and some people might see it as perhaps a bit divorced from just discussing the raw economic power of those nations.
Yes, and I think your point is absolutely central to this whole project, that we're dealing with countries that are big and have enormous economies, but are also poor relative to us. In the case of China, I think one of the positives about China, there are a lot of negatives, particularly in the political sphere, but in economic terms, their standards of living have massively improved over the last 4 decades. It is one of the claims of the leadership of China that they've abolished what's called absolute poverty, which is a very minimal standard set by the World Bank to measure absolute poverty. But certainly, you just need to go to China and look around and see that poverty, in the sense that we recognized in many poor countries, has largely gone. It's still the case that in the sort of inward areas and in remote rural areas, you still have people who are poor by European standards, but certainly in the big cities, living standards are now middle income approaching high income. In India's case, it's more difficult because although there has been a lot of progress, there's still a lot of poverty, and particularly in rural areas. And there's a big argument going on in India about how you measure poverty and whether poverty is increasing or decreasing. But certainly compared with 30, 40 years ago, there's been an enormous increase in the number of people who Indians call middle class, not middle class in terms of suburban Britain, but middle class in global terms. And also the fact that, the very poorest people in India now have access to basic services. And you don't encounter what you did decades ago, certainly in British times, where large scale famine and destitution. There's still a lot of very poor people, but the scale of the problem is gradually diminishing with economic growth.
Absolutely. And two figures that are central to that image of economic growth are the leaders of the respective countries, both Modi and Xi Jinping, and both have managed to project themselves as very much the faces of the politics of their countries. Do you think that that perhaps makes it difficult for sometimes Western leaders who obviously don't necessarily have the same kind of institutional place within the political discussions of their country and the body politics of their country to deal with these leaders, because obviously both Xi Jinping and Modi have powers and sort of status that is much more dictatorial in some ways as compared to Western leaders. Do you think that makes it difficult for Western leaders who can obviously be, called in front of Parliament or called in front of the Senate and have to deal with the elected representatives of their country in a much firmer way than Modi and Xi Jinping do? Do you think that makes it difficult for Western leaders in
Yes,
dealing with them?
it does. But I think we need to make it clear there is a big distinction between China and India. I mean, China is a very authoritarian one-party state. It's become more so under Xi Jinping. There were, under his predecessor, a few small signs of greater flexibility, election of mayors, this kind of thing, and that's gone. And one of the features of Xi Jinping is you have very strong leadership. it's very clear who's the boss, who you're dealing with,
Mhm.
and he's been pretty ruthless in weeding out people who might constitute opposition. Indeed, one of the weaknesses of China politically is that although they have a very strong leader, he hasn't got a succession lined up.
Mhm.
When the process of reform started under Deng Xiaoping, who post Mao, which was the source of China's success. Deng also had a mechanism whereby effectively the leadership was replaced in an orderly way every 10 years. Well, Deng, Xi has now broken that tradition. It's not at all clear what will happen whether when he gets ill or dies or is got rid of. Um, India, on the other hand, still has many of the characteristics of a democracy. It is absolutely remarkable that a country of 1.4 billion people with enormous differences, religion, language, region, has managed to hold together a functioning democracy. There still is.
Mhm.
Modi has shown signs of authoritarianism and silencing people in the opposition, stoking up hostility towards the Islamic minority.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, we showed at the last election in India, the ruling party can still be knocked back and experience, humiliation at the polls. And there is a high level of accountability in India, despite Modi's attempt to throttle some of it.
Mhm. And both leaders are in their own way somewhat sort of nationalistic in terms of their rhetoric. Do you think that makes it particularly difficult for the Labour Party, which is often viewed as perhaps more of an internationalist party, to deal with them, given that there is perhaps more of a nationalistic tone to both leaders?
Yes, the problem about dealing with China is that Western leaders, including the British government, sets standards based on what they regard as human rights. And of course, the Chinese operate on different standards. They regard human rights as centering on economic and social development rather than on freedom of speech and the things which matter to us. So there is a fundamental disconnect there. But nonetheless, the Chinese government is coherent. You deal with it, decisions are made, and it's possible to have practical business-like relationship. Dealing with India is difficult in a different way. That we have had these reports of persecution of Muslims, and that's partially true. There are counter arguments there. And that's quite difficult for countries like the UK, where there is a substantial Muslim minority that's very vocal. And relations with the British government are quite tense because there are supporters of, Kashmiri independence or supporters of Pakistan who in the UK who complicate the relations between governments.
Mhm.
But we have business-like relations with both countries, and we should have. There are very large numbers of Chinese and Indian students in British universities who are, I think, very good for us, bring in revenue and helpful to universities. We have substantial amount of trade with both countries. You can argue about imbalance in the case of China, but nonetheless, it matters to both of us. Chinese and Indian companies, they have large numbers of highly successful multinational companies now. An Indian company owns the biggest and most important company in the British car industry, steel.
Yeah.
Chinese, more controversially, were very active in telecommunications. They've been booted out of that. But nonetheless, both countries are very important in international commerce.
And I think you touched upon there that there are obviously, lots of people who live in Britain, lots of British citizens who obviously have links both to India but also to Pakistan, to Kashmir as well. Do you think that because Modi himself has described himself as the emperor of Hindu hearts, and as you mentioned in the book, do you think that there is perhaps a concern about, how best to deal with relations between Britain and India? Obviously, the recent trade deal is something that brings the two countries a little bit closer together. There's concern about how to deal with them because of worries about possible sectarianism that may occur in the UK dependent on Britain's relationship with India.
Yeah, we shouldn't allow it to overshadow our relations with India. When I was in the government, I think I did 4 official visits to India.
Hmm.
We made considerable progress, I think, in building up relationships. But you do know that in the background, in Indian domestic politics, there is sectarianism is an
Hmm.
issue.
Yeah.
Modi had one of the questions never really been answered, which was the role he played when he was chief minister of Gujarat in a
Hmm.
massacre of Muslims. Again, it's a complicated story. It's not
Hmm.
really clear how he was involved. But anyway, that's something we have to live with. We're not ruling India anymore, and I think we have to be realistic about Britain's capacity to influence the politics of other countries. And I think we need to be a bit careful about that and deal
Hmm.
with China and India in a business-like way. We have
Hmm.
common interests that, in a way, are much more important. I mean, after all, the planet,
Hmm. Yeah.
climate change, these are the two countries which in future will be making the greatest level of emissions.
Hmm.
China already is by far, but they're also the source of the main technologies to combat it, particularly China. Um, and we've got to work with them on these issues.
Absolutely, and you mentioned the Gujarat massacre there, which is again something you touch upon in the book as well. I just wonder, do you think that that's something that was ever mentioned during trade negotiations, given that obviously British citizens were involved in that, or do you think that that was something that was not mentioned at all, and should it or shouldn't it have been?
I doubt it was, and
Mm.
I don't think it would have been appropriate.
Hmm.
And of course, China's also got its problems in
Hmm.
that area. This whole issue around what's happened in Xinjiang, and the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner produced a very damning report. But I mean, in reality, there is nothing that Britain can do about it, and
Hmm.
it's not terribly clear that it helps for Britain to raise these issues. If we're talking to the Chinese, there are legitimate concerns about Hong Kong, which do
Hmm.
affect them because a lot of
Hmm.
British nationals are involved. So it's quite right to raise that as an issue with the Chinese. Because it's a proper British interest. It may be an irritant, but it has to be
Hmm.
raised.
Yeah.
I think the issues around Xinjiang are best left to the United Nations, who will be doing a very professional job and reporting on it.
Hmm. One thing that you mentioned in the book, which I found fascinating, was the levels of local spending. In India, it's about 3%, where local government is able to spend on services related to them, whereas in China, it's about 51%. Could you just explain why that's important and why there is also that difference there in the amount of local government money that is spent in the respective countries by local authorities?
Well, it's a very important question. I'm glad you raised it, and it's something in the West we're perhaps not very conscious of, and it's particularly important for China that because China is run by the Communist Party, has a very powerful leader.
Hmm.
I think we assume that all decisions are made in Beijing by Xi Jinping, and
Hmm.
that is not the way China has been governed. The big political decisions are obviously made at the center, but administratively, China is very decentralized. And that has both pluses and minuses. The plus is that you've had an enormous amount of kind of entrepreneurial activity by local government, a lot of the big initiatives to build infrastructure, to support innovation in new industries comes from local government. And you have literally 100 flowers blooming in China, and a lot of the energy and the drive in the period of economic reform came from the bottom, not from the top. But the weakness is that local government has, to some extent, financially got out of control. spending a lot of money they didn't have, creating complicated financial instruments. Um, the use of the word bankruptcy is a little bit questionable in this area, but a lot of local government in China has got into extreme financial difficulties. It partly accounts for the difficulties of central government. So China is, in many respects, very decentralized, despite having strong central government under a single party. India is an interesting contrast because it's a federal country and a lot of power is delegated to the states, though some of that has been trimmed. But what is very weak in India is local government. They have a so-called panchayat system with local councils, but they don't have much power, don't have much money. And so, where things are clogged up in New Delhi, it means that the whole country doesn't progress. And you don't have that kind of local energy and initiative that you've had in China.
Mm. And I think it's interesting as well when we look at local government in the sort of like in the UK context and and the US, how different they are as well. And I wonder, do you think that the examples of both China and India perhaps it should maybe let us reflect on the way that we run local government in the UK? Do you think that there are any sort of like lessons in either the
Yeah,
yeah?
Britain is a highly centralized country.
Mm,
Local government has really little real power.
mm,
The government simply uses it as a getting other people to make unpopular decisions very often. It's begun to turn in the last decade. I think the emergence of these powerful local mayors, Manchester, Birmingham, I think this is actually a change for the better. You are beginning to get real energy at a local level. To some extent, we already have that with Scottish devolution.
mhm,
But certainly at council level in the UK, you've got virtual paralysis with councils almost bankrupt and able to do very little. And
mhm,
it's poor. I mean, by comparison with Germany or France or
mhm,
Italy, very little real devolution of decision making in the UK.
absolutely. And one of the things you also comment on in the book is Xi Jinping's dream of a sort of like of a kind of like a one China, a strong China, a China that is, able to stand on its own 2 feet, which you make comparisons with the Make America Great movement of President Trump. To what extent do you think that the tariffs and the result of the tariffs that have been implemented by President Trump have damaged his Make America Great movement and strengthened Xi Jinping's One China movement because they've shown the economic power of China as versus the United States?
Well, I think the big difference is that the China dream that President Xi talks about is forward looking. Whereas MAGA is backward looking. It's nostalgia for a time when the United States was the dominant manufacturing power in the world, and that is very much now China. In technology, it's, I think, 50-50. We're seeing a very close race in many core technologies, but certainly the way the Chinese have a very long-term perspective, and that they're looking at this competition with the United States, and they've got technological industrial strategies designed to make sure they win it. The United States is partly doing that. I mean, part of the rationale behind Trump's tariff is to rebuild their manufacturing capacity, but in a rather incoherent way, and also to ensure that the technology gap with China works in America's favor. So in a way, they have the same objectives in that sense. But the problem with Trump's tariff is that it's utterly sort of incoherent. I mean,
Mm,
you have very large tariffs being slapped on poor African countries and for political reasons,
mhm,
as we've seen with Brazil. Switzerland is one of the biggest casualties. I mean, it's very difficult to understand the logic behind it. and the link between the imposition of tariffs and the recreation of America's technological leadership is very weak indeed. I mean, actually, the problems in advanced technology have very little to do with tariffs. Where I think the area which most needs attention is the issue around chips, which of
Mhm.
course are the building block of artificial intelligence and other core technologies. And the evidence which seems to be emerging is that the attempts by the United States to impose embargoes on key high-tech chips have been counterproductive. It's really just encouraged the Chinese to push forward with a more self-reliant approach to this, which may be inefficient, but is certainly producing results.
And obviously, as you mentioned, the chips there, one of the most important manufacturers of that is Taiwan. China obviously has a quite a difficult, to put it politely, difficult relationship with Taiwan. Do you think that this means that Western nations, the US, the UK, should perhaps step up its support for Taiwan, or do you think that the kind of the worries about a possible situation similar to that we've seen with Russia and Ukraine between China and Taiwan are somewhat over exaggerated, and that China is unlikely to try something on a similar scale?
I simply don't know. I don't think anybody does.
Mm,
There's a lot of ambiguity. There's an enormous gap between Chinese rhetoric and Chinese posturing around Taiwan and what it is actually doing or likely to do. I mean, when you think about it, and the problems of invading Taiwan are enormous. It's 100 miles straight, getting an amphibious navy launched. I mean, it's far more difficult than D-Day, and
mm,
it's already been pre-announced. So, and also the Chinese armed forces is not as formidable as sometimes argued. I mean, they've been riddled with corruption. There's a lot of politics. And the Chinese armed forces have never actually been involved in a war for
mm,
decades. There's a minor war with Vietnam, I think 40 years ago,
mm,
over 40 years ago. So they haven't got any sort of battle experience. And I think my sense, and I'm not a expert in this, my sense is that the Chinese are desperately anxious to avoid getting into military conflict, but at the same time, they do have a powerful political objective, which is reunification of the country. The current president has emphasized that. His own prestige is at stake to some
mm,
extent. What is complicating the matter at the moment, of course, is that there is a lot of division within Taiwan itself. Although I think it's very clear the majority of people in Taiwan, certainly younger generation, are very concerned to keep their separate identity. There are a lot of people who do see Taiwan as part of China, and you see that in some of the bitter arguments that are going on in Taiwanese politics at the moment. I think the awkwardness of the rest of the world is that unlike Ukraine, which was recognized as an
mhm,
independent country, which Russia invaded, hardly anybody recognizes Taiwan.
mhm,
It's a peculiar place which exists in practice as a separate political economic entity, but doesn't exist in theory.
mhm,
Hardly anybody recognizes it. So the idea that the world will sort of rush to support Taiwan in the event of Chinese actual intervention is very ambiguous.
mm,
The Americans have been very careful, even under Trump, not to overcommit themselves. They've left what they call strategic ambiguity. They want the Chinese to feel that they would come to Taiwan's help if there was an invasion, but on the other hand, they don't want to be totally committed to it. So it's a very high level of uncertainty. And if you've got escalating military capacity on all sides, uncertainty is probably not the best place you want to be. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. But one issue that we've touched upon a little bit that I think that you could still see a degree of cooperation between China, India, and the rest of the world is obviously on the issue of climate change. Do you think that this is something that we're going to see perhaps firmer commitment on? Because China and India, obviously, as you mentioned towards the start of the podcast, are countries that are going to be emitting more and continue to emit more than other nations. Do you think that that's an area that there's going to be perhaps a firming up of resolutions in coming years to cutting emissions and to making these nations, perhaps if not carbon neutral, but on the path towards it?
Yes, I think that the key point here is that in both cases, national interests are what are driving them. Both China and India are currently victims of climate change. The massive temperature extremes are being experienced, massive flooding events. I think both the Chinese and Indian authorities are very conscious of the fact that climate change is not something that they're contributing to, but they're also victims of. So it's very much in their self-interest to sort this problem out. Similarly, their self-interest lies in what they would regard as security. I mean, the Chinese are obsessed by the fact that they potentially are surrounded by American sanctions and retaliatory sanctions, and that they therefore have to be secure. And being cut off from oil supplies worries them, and so therefore they continue to invest in coal alongside new renewables. In India's case, they're very anxious to keep their coal industry alive because it's a massive employer, and that coal is in a part of the country where there's the biggest energy demand. So they have very conflicted, ambiguous attitudes. But I think in both cases, and particularly in China's case, there is a genuine commitment to meet climate commitments. I think in net zero 2060, I think is China's objective. I think they've passed peak greenhouse gas emissions within the last year or so. So you can see progress, but at the same time they've got other objectives.
Yes, and it's clear as well that one of those other objectives, particularly in the case of China, relates to artificial intelligence, relates to AI, and that's something that I think both China and the US have obviously been clearly very invested in, and the UK government is obviously wanting to invest in AI as well. What do you think is the future of artificial intelligence in terms of how effective it will be at assisting the economy? Do you think that AI does have the kind of the potential that certain people, particularly AI developers, have suggested that it has? And how much of AI's influence do you think will be related to the specific country that the AI originates from? So, like with the US, we've obviously got ChatGPT, China, DeepSeek.
Well, artificial intelligence potentially is enormously important in stimulating productivity. I suspect that some of this is hyped. Uh, you get this massive inflation in stock market values because people anticipate things that are happening that may not ultimately happen. So, but undoubtedly, it's massively important. I think we need to distinguish, AI in general from the arguments about artificial general intelligence, which is this, creation of superhumans who will be able to do extraordinary things, we think, for both good and ill. It's striking that the Chinese are very keen to have international rules around artificial intelligence, particularly artificial general intelligence, because I think they realize that this could potentially get out of control. Whether they're sincere, we don't know, but in a way, their position of wanting to have disciplines and controls around AI are actually paradoxically a bit closer to Europe and the UK than they are to the USA, which is much more libertarian. But this is an important area, but partly because most of us are not really au fait with the technology, we probably don't fully appreciate. But this is at least as important as the issues around climate change.
Absolutely. We're coming towards the end of the podcast, and thank you for taking the time to speak to me, Vince. But I do have one final question for you. The book is obviously a fascinating one, and I think you explore the issues with a great deal of clarity. But for people who are going to read the book, what one thing do you hope that they take away from reading it when they've finished the final page and they're closing the book?
Well, I hope they will get in their heads that the future in the world economy and not just economy, environmental, military, the center of gravity of that world will be in Asia, and in particular with these two big countries. And that's something we need to get used to. And it means more traveling there, learning the languages, recognizing that the future lies there more than where it's traditionally been in Europe and the United States. And that requires a different way of looking at the world and a certain amount of humility.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again for taking the time to record the podcast with me.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.